Yeah.
Rightio. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this workshop for the Assets and Infrastructure Committee. While we're all here, most of us know each other, but in the back corner we've got Dr. Julian Elder, who's our new chair of the Water Services CCA. Right. So who's running it today? Penny?
Penny and myself.
Right. I'll hand over to you.
So Penny's just handing around the resolution from the March 19th council meeting.
Just in case anyone can't remember what that was on. What's lot?
Roughly.
So the intent of this workshop is to directly deal with and respond and propose a way forward for resolution 3 and the resolution yourself, which is, you recall that March 19th you approved the option 1, which is the direct discharge of Kawerau, the 35-year consent and everything else. Resolution 3 asked the director to chief exec to undertake further investigations into long-term disposal options. The purpose of today's workshop is to take you through currently and how we address that particular resolution. So we've got a bit of a presentation we'll just run through very quickly. So there's 3 elements to that in a way, and this is all centred around investigating further potential other options relating to particularly land-based and hybrid land water options, and to report back by March 2027 in terms of, and I'm quoting, a decision for a final decision on a long-term solution, including whether to retain the primary option, which is this proposed discharge of Kawerau, or to shift to an alternative option or a combination of both. So what I wanted to do today is just to work through our current thinking about how we might do that. You will note that in terms of the note that came out, our proposal is to deal in the public part of the workshop around a couple of components to that, and then for a discussion in terms of particularly the recent letter from Kai Tahu move into non-public for that. We'd also like to take the opportunity to update you on the mediation outcomes for a short-term consent, and also cover off one other matter. So happy with that? Right, so the resolution itself, we're just doing 3. So just noting that we're asking the chief executive to undertake further investigations to identify and assess reasonably practical waste disposal options, including land-based hybrid land options that may minimise the extent of the discharge treated effluent to water and the provision of that information to understand in the community. And then we're looking at, includes further hui with tied to Tahu Runaka, further community engagement and the preparation of a further report. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Penny, because to take you through that glorious diagram on the screen, which I've also circulated to you previously, just to, because this helps explain our thinking around 3 main components of this work. So happy with that?
Excellent. All right, so there are 3 streams of engagement that we're looking at for this next phase, where we would be wanting to engage with each of these 3 groups in parallel in order to work through with them the process we've been through to date, the options that were long listed, so going through the original options to make sure that people understand those, but then giving each of these groups an opportunity to engage in conversation about those options so they understand them, but also to identify whether they believe there are particularly hybrid or land-based options that weren't considered originally. And then if there are any additional options that are identified through that process, for the team to go away and do the technical analysis on those, bring them back through those groups through a similar to the process you will have already seen in terms of option identification, but adding them to the work that's already been done and revalidating with these groups the assumptions and criteria that were used through that process. So that any new options can be assessed against the previous shortlist and the preferred option to see if they perform better.
Can you explain again how the criteria review will take place? I'm just trying to understand how we pull out all of the assumptions and test them. And you were suggesting that we might be testing them with mana whenua or with a deliberative democracy.
So perhaps we start, one way of answering that might be to deal with the first component, which is the council workshops. So our proposal is to use the Asset and Infrastructure Committee, and can go on to that as a sort of a governing body around that, and to review, look through the work that's already been done, look at the assumptions, look at the options that have been identified, use that as a way of trying to tease that out and provide for direct council input into at that stage. So that we've, we're making sure that we've covered off the basis that's needed here.
Okay. So
I should also note, sorry, that it's also a question who's going to do all that work, which we'll come to, but GHD have done all their background work. They're available to assist in this and review that. So proposal is that the Asset and Infrastructure Committee provide that council political oversight and input into that part of the process.
I think so. In terms of the how, I think what we want to do, sorry, I should have said this up front. So what we have here is a high level of outline of the proposed approach, and what we want to get from you is feedback on this so we can then frame up the detail of how it would actually happen. So this is kind of a principles, we're talking about the principles of the approach here, and if you're comfortable with the principles we're talking about, then we'll proceed with this approach, but form up the detail of how it'll be done.
for me, how that criteria and the assumptions are reviewed is a key piece of the puzzle, and getting fresh eyes on that, fresh legal advice, fresh advice where we need it. Because if we need to start from a good foundation for the rest of it. So I'd like, I guess.
Fresh legal advice.
Oh, we were told there was advice around needing to do the lowest cost option, and basically I felt anyway that we were directed into the option that we're doing because it was just naturally the lowest cost. Now, I've had a number of conversations with a number of people. It's the most cost effective for what you're trying to achieve. So defining the objective. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing here. Is like, what is our objective? Therefore, how do you get to that in the most cost effective way? If your assumptions are that you have to go the cheapest option, just as an example of one of the assumptions, we might need someone to look at how those WEPs are defined and whether we need some different advice around that.
So the intent is that will be tested through this process with you, with the community, and with mana whenua, supported by the experts that are required to support that. So the detail of how we'll do that and who we would ask for advice hasn't been worked through yet. But the intent is that this is a process to test those assumptions, as well as to determine if any of these groups can identify options that we can further investigate to add into that process. So
I guess my feedback would be, I'd like to understand the how is going to be really important. So rather than leaving it to you to just go and decide how, if that bit isn't right, then the rest of it can.
So
I think I've heard what you're concerned about, so we'll take that into account into the
part
design
of that process would be through the Assets and Infrastructure Committee. We set up a series of workshops around that to tease that out. And just to note, we do have an existing set of experts who are familiar with this, so we provide the backbone of that information too as well. But it needs to be tested.
Yeah.
So we've got 30 minutes for the presentation and 30 minutes for discussion. Do you want to, unless they're really quick questions, until the discussion part?
Sorry, I won't take 30 minutes either.
Right.
So that's the basis of what the work will be. However, the way that we will work through that is through these three streams of engagement. And so, as Tony touched on, what we're proposing is to use this committee as the council vehicle to be working through the next stages of this. And the first step in that would be, as we just discussed, in part looking at the assumptions, but also in part this group identifying additional options that we can add to be investigated if there are gaps in the existing, if there's perceived gaps in what has already been identified. So alongside that, we would also be aiming to have an engagement process with mana whenua. Obviously, we'll come back to that in the public excluded part of this meeting, but the intent here is that we take a relationship-based approach, working with them to work through this process from the existing work through to where there are options that they might feel that haven't been investigated enough, and testing the assumptions in the same way that we just talked about before, and that would be an iterative process working with them over this period. And that would sit along, both of those would sit alongside a deliberative process. Sorry. Yeah, a deliberative process with the community. So this is, you've had discussions around this table about those more deliberative processes, and so this is an opportunity to use one of those processes with a representative group from the community in terms of same kind of material in terms of working through the options, identifying any additional options that could be that might be able to be investigated, testing the assumptions, and then bringing those back together with the council work stream to inform the report that would come through in March next year. So I would caveat all of that by saying this is not much time to do these in the way that we're talking about. So hence why we wanted to get a, we want to get a principle, in principle, an agreement to these principles before cracking on with the work, but we do need to get on with it to make sure that we can do each of these work streams and the further work if necessary justice over this time.
And just,
So Tony,
just on that, timing is critical. In order to meet the March 2027 report deadline, we really need to have most of this work done before Christmas.
Yeah.
Because to meet March, we have a report done in February. The Christmas period is a bit of a nightmare. So that does impose some limits on our broad ranging disability. So we need to be quite focused and targeted if we're going to meet that date. If we don't meet that date, if it's pushed out, then increasingly, as noted in the resolution, it becomes also a CCO decision. We need to be involved in that as well as you move further through.
yeah, well, I think it's worth just identifying that conversation we're having in relation to the transitional governance and decision-making framework for the CCO means that the timeframes involved in this, that the CCO board will need to be sitting alongside you for part of the journey in this council work stream, but also then with the decision in March.
The only bit that worries me is the deliberative democracy, but not because it's deliberative democracy, because that would be great. But if you've got a time frame, and this is the first time we will have done it, we haven't got a framework for doing it, for deciding who's representative and who's not, for it's new. So that's the only bit that concerns me, given the time frame.
So the team are confident it can be done in the time frame if we get started planning it now, but it'll need investment. So none of these, that requires additional investment to make sure that we can get that right, as does doing this cycle of looking at options and assumptions.
And so just on that front, it's a bit hard to know what the budget might be, but given the time frames we've got and the sort of costs we're talking about, engaging with your experts to provide that input, it's probably in the realm of $500,000 to $600,000, just ballpark for this sort of process, given that sort of time frame.
The experts.
No. Well, if we do a deliberative democracy process, one of the proposals is to fund those participants to a certain extent, because it's quite an extensive requirement on them, and that would need to be worked through. And then there's the time and even with the Mana-whenua partnership, we haven't established how that would actually be operated in terms of that consultation process. So that would come through. So just being realistic about the sort of budget we're talking about this, we can cover that within the overall project capital, but there is a cost to all of this. And I think in terms of the deliberative democracy, it's also trying to be clear around what it is that we are asking of that group within that time frame that we've got and what's realistic. So things to go through.
What question? Their decision.
So on the deliberative democracy part, there is, that would be, because it's something we haven't done before, and we're building our capability in that space, that would be something that we would get experts to support us in. And actually, I should have mentioned what we're looking at doing is getting an independent person to facilitate this whole cycle. Part of that is capacity of our existing team, but part of it is also ensuring that we have lot of it is to make sure that we can have that focus on it, but making sure that we've got that fresh eyes, bringing everything together. And so we're talking we're trying to work through who would be the right person for that at the moment. And we haven't landed that yet, but part of it is getting agreement from you, some directional statements from you today about the approach before kind of bringing them in as well.
Do you have a question?
I'm just trying to clarify this for my own self. So in terms of, you referred to experts and council staff have looked at this a lot. To what extent does 500,000 or 600,000 or whatever the number is incorporate people who are completely independent of the studies that have been done previously? In other words, what I'm interested in is, would we have the same people looking at these options that have looked at these options for many years in the past, or would we have someone completely independent?
That's not part of the current budget. That would be an additional cost and would be quite difficult to do within the timeframes we've got. We could bring it in. We've got one consultant that's been used, that's been peer reviewed by a second consultant. We are confident that they've considered the options, and this process will allow for the consideration of any other options as well. If you wanted to bring in completely new consultants, then I don't think we could actually achieve this within the 6 months timeframe we've got.
So you're confident that in throwing
Well, I
a
don't think
consultant,
so, but we'll leave that for now for the discussion. So we'll carry on the presentation.
So I think that is the presentation. Essentially what we're wanting to do here is we are wanting to bring in, identify whether there are additional options that could be assessed rather than reassessing the existing options. We have a list of options. This process is to engage with these three groups of stakeholders, being yourselves, the community and mana whenua, for them to identify if there are other options that they think could have been considered that weren't, for us to take them away and consider them, and then for us to work through the assumptions with these three groups, and to then reapply those assumptions to the long list shortlisting process, along with any additional options that might have been identified.
I think it also provides for the testing of those assumptions, testing whether the assumptions are valid, whether they limited the choice. If we remove those, what would that look like? And reporting back around those as well. So,
and a lot of those assumptions will be technical assumptions that experts, understand and that people potentially don't. So I think Q's point is highly relevant, because if we don't get the assumptions right, or if they're broad enough, if we shove down a tunnel, we're not going to get, it's not going to be worth going through the process. So I think the foundation's key. If we have to absolutely have fresh eyes on the assumptions, because we know that staff didn't believe there was any ability to look at land disposal. So,
It's been prepared
well, the
by,
word was
that's not true.
unicorn.
it's been
in the
prepared by
meetings.
other like consultants,
It was.
and they've been peer reviewed. So this work is going to look at those assumptions that have been made,
By the same people that made the
not
assumption.
necessarily, but maybe by the same company. But
Yeah.
there's a lot of work that's gone into this already. To start again from scratch just because you want a different answer.
No, we're testing assumptions.
good use of-
We're not starting from scratch. We're doing
That's what
what
you're
we're
asking.
suggesting as it's a desktop review, looking at the assumptions that were made and whether they're valid or too narrow.
Well, it's more than just that.
And what is that?
And you're asking for a new set of consultants to come in and start again.
No, again, we're asking for a peer review of the assumptions
We
that
have a
drove
peer
the
review of the
outcome.
assumptions. You're wanting a peer
No, we
review of the
didn't.
peer review.
We didn't have a peer review.
There has been a peer review.
I remember something about that, but it was very light touch, wasn't it? It was
May have been, but
yeah.
It may be that once we get into the process, we can test it a bit more, because
Yes.
some of the assumptions are around environmental standards. And one of the criticisms, I think, was in terms of the long list, a view around the cost of some of the land-based disposal options, removing those. We can revisit that. We can come back around that. I'm not sure what the other assumptions are that would be outside of a standard set of assumptions for this sort of assessment, and whether we'd actually obviously other ones that would come along.
I think so. I mean, ultimately, it's a decision of the council, isn't it? And if the council wants,
Last is for a report to come back looking at if there are any other options that haven't been presented already.
I guess what I'm suggesting is that if we did want fresh eyes on it, it would be up to us around the table to look at that. And if we did want to put it to a vote and make that call. I'm just worried that we're going to go through a really expensive process by the looks of it. And if we do it, it needs to be worthwhile. I don't think it necessarily costs an awful lot of money to have somebody pull out the assumptions and do a review of those.
So just sort of pragmatic here though. So we're looking at some assumptions. So the cost-based assumption, like I don't think we can remove that it needs to be cost-effective on some level. But from memory, you had issues with assumptions around a single piece of land or land disposal. That was one of the assumptions.
I don't know what all the assumptions are buried in there, and I don't.
20-year or 20-60-year flows or something like that. Are those the ones you're talking about? Like,
Oh, they would be some of them. So we were suggesting, we approached it as in, we didn't look at partial discharge to land and partial, so that was kind of ruled out. And there was this assumption that we had to have one block of land to do it all. And so that was, so those, but no, but those are,
look at segmented.
A risk of trying to explore options
Yeah.
and look outside the box with the exact same folks who have already given us that risk. We're just going to be in a circular loop.
But what I'm
We're going to
saying
get the
here
same answer as we did
those are the
before.
assumptions.
And so in fact, we shouldn't even, maybe we shouldn't even direct, I mean, sorry to be cynical, but maybe we shouldn't even direct staff to even approach this, because the point is to get a fresh set of eyes on this.
Yep.
And we keep going in this circular loop. And
Not a fresh set of eyes on the whole thing.
What's that?
Not a fresh set of eyes on the whole thing,
Why not?
because that resolution doesn't say a fresh set of eyes on the whole thing. It says about exploring land-based and hybrid land water options.
All right,
It does.
let's see what
Right,
Martha
so-
and the community says.
So
but the
I
point.
have a question, please, Mr.
To
Chair.
go here and then after him.
I'm just curious to know, so the process on the left with stakeholder engagement, are you thinking that all happens at the same time?
It kind of
Because-
has to, given the timeframes we've got,
Well, the only thing that I'm thinking is
except your
that,
bit would start earlier.
well, I'm almost wondering whether our bit should start later once we've had a chance to go through the first two. Because the first two options are the way, in my mind, to come up with potentially new options.
Yeah.
Because your council workshop talks about test the long list options and assumptions, which is sort of not really blue sky, doesn't feel like blue sky thinking for us. But the other two do. That makes sense?
Yep. I think the
I'm just
council
trying to-
workshop though will in part bottom out some of the things that Nikki's raising. So was one of the assumptions that we could only have one contiguous piece of land? Or did we go back and look at actually options that weren't that?
Right.
Did we look at hybrid options? How was that incorporated? Actually going back through some of that is what part of what that workshop is about. And I think talking to Simon when we were sitting behind this, when we were preparing this, if the peer review didn't look at something in as much detail as we might want, I don't think there's anything stopping us from getting a peer review. We'll have to get a peer review of anything new we do anyway, because we got a peer review last time. And if we want that peer review of this updated work to look particularly at assumptions or something like that, I don't think there's anything to stop that.
And the reason for suggesting the assets and infrastructure committee is as an ongoing, I suppose, governance oversight over this. So it's not sort of independent of those other processes, but as a start of looking at what the work is around the land-based options, the hybrid options, having a discussion on those assumptions. Do they go far enough? Do they not go far enough? Understand where that community deliberative process might be heading. So that was an idea of having a governance oversight, because the last thing I want to do is go through a lengthy process and then councillors around the table going, well, we didn't know what's happening, we're involved. That's the proposal for that committee, as sort of series of workshops to have that role.
Yeah, the other thing is I don't know whether everyone had a chance to read the long list report, which was issued last year anyway.
Yes.
But it was, my view has always been that there's probably a whole lot of other things that weren't included in the long list report that were also considered at the time.
Yes.
And those might be the things you're thinking of.
Yes.
They've already been, they didn't make it to the long list.
Yeah.
John, do you have a question?
Thanks. So have you been following developments in Christchurch City and Akaroa, and where similar concerns were raised, particularly by Mana Whenua, that have resulted in a significantly, like 3 times more expensive solution than what was originally proposed.
I'm aware of, there's been some media comments about that. That's the extent of my understanding.
Okay, because I think just one thing I think we need to, particularly given the Mana Whenua concerns about where we've gone with this, that if anything is going to have a fresh set of eyes on it, is how the cultural component is considered and taken on board in these deliberations. Because what happened in that case, from what I've seen of it, is that, and similarly in Manawa 2, Palms North, in 21, where there were much cheaper options available. But the only solution that was acceptable to the broader community was a more expensive one. And so it was because it was the only one that actually met the needs, whatever those needs were, environmental and cultural predominantly, that were then tenable. So it's not just the cheapest, it's the one that delivers what's acceptable.
Yeah, well, there is a note on here under the deliberative democracy session about willingness to pay.
Yeah, quite, and that might well be key. And so, yeah, so I like the way that you've done this. You're proposing that it's got these 3 elements to it. We need to make sure that the cultural component gets the mana that it deserves. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in a difficult position in the future.
I think the only comment I'd make on that is that councils who made decisions in 2021 were under a very different
Sure.
in a very different environment, environmental standards process, and we now have the Local Government Water Services Act and the Economic Regulation, which does put us in a different situation. But
Agreed.
Yeah.
What is the?
Sorry, I think I was going to come up with a couple of questions. So looking at the resolution, so item 2, so approving option 1 and to prepare the resource consent application ready to be lodged. So that's the direction that staff were given, and presumably they're well onto that. But 3D talks about a report coming in March for final decision on the long-term solution, including whether to retain the primary option or shift. So if the staff have gone ahead, prepared the resource consent application, then if something comes along in March,
sorry.
if something comes along in March, then is that a reality? Is it really going to be able to change that resource consenting? Because it's number 2 completely sort of preempting anything that might come out of D. That's a question to think about. And I guess the other question, or that would pose, I think Nikki's Kieran alluded to it. If I'm from the outside looking in, and from a Mana Whenua perspective, they've been very clear about what's important to them and what their priorities are, and the organisations had been very aware of that, and through all the processes, all the many reports, has come up with a particular solution. And when we discussed it around the table, we were told that was the solution, basically that there were no other options that would be considered. So how, when you have the same staff in the organisation dealing with the same consultants and experts, how, in what circumstances would you ever get to come up with a different option? And if you think there's an opportunity to do that, why wasn't that part of the discussion we had 2 months ago? So that's
So 2 parts. Check with Brenda around the question of the consenting. The resolutions themselves approved application being lodged by the 31st of May, and that's their own design. If the decision of March 2027 is to change that to another process or solution, then we'd have to apply for another application and rework all that. That's not beyond bounds, possibly what we said at the time, that applying for a consent does not ultimately, the council could change its decision at that point, and there has to be a new consent process application and more work done. But
Developers do it all the time. They'll get one consent and then they go and decide they want to change it, so they get another consent. It's just the costs of getting the consent that you're paying. But that's a decision that council made, that they would go ahead with all of the investment that they've got to prepare the current consent, and then they would do this piece of work.
But their decision might not be judicially reviewed.
So that was the discussion we had when we made this decision too, that there's nothing, if we get a consent for this, what we've got as our, chosen as our option now, there's nothing to stop us applying for another consent for a different option at some time in the future.
Yeah, and
But also, the other question, or the other thoughts that I've had with the second part of your question is that even if in March next year, there is another solution presented as an option and we decide that, actually go for that as well, that if it's land-based, it's potentially going to take a number of years for it to actually be operational. And in the meantime, we've got a discharge into the Shotover River at the moment that we need to have another solution for in the interim.
It's actually one of the points. The option one, which is the discharge, was seen as an emergency discharge and required discharge in any event, even if we had land-based disposal or hybrid option, because there's still going to be some way of disposing of the highly treated wastewater at that point. So that was part of the option one proposal under any scenario.
Yeah, that's the reality, isn't it? That we,
Option one is part of all the other options apart from the Crown Terrace option.
even if,
Even then, it's what we needed in the time.
even the best
If it
circumstances,
gets-
there
if
would
it
be.
gets approved,
Yeah.
still need consent.
Well, that's the thing. It still has to go for consent, and then people still have the chance to submit against it or for it or whatever they want to do.
In the meantime, we've got an ongoing discharge situation, which we can't suddenly turn off, so we need consent. That's part of the thinking, the reasoning behind what we got to.
Brendan.
Yeah, and that, I'm just picking up on something the mayor was asking before around, well, we're now talking about different options, but we had our experts saying these are your options. A big part of that is that you have a town now with a huge demand for wastewater services. And even if you wanted to shift to, say, an entire land-based option, you're talking decades, you're not talking years in terms of building a pot, finding the land, the 300 acres, managing to buy it or compulsorily acquire it, building a pipeline, dealing with all the appeals. You're not going to get through that process in under a decade. So in terms of what our experts thought were reasonably practicable options, it's got to be something that's available when the short-term consent, which we're going for, so that we're ready to switch it on, not something that might be available in 20 years' time. So it's not just about the cost, it's also about timing.
But we're going for a 35-year consent.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's not a short-term consent.
No,
No, we don't have to use it for 35 years.
So the short-term consent is reference to the 5-year consent that we're applying for to give our discharge for the show, which currently we have unconsented and as emergency works response. So remember, the 5-year consent was anticipated to give us time to apply for the long-term consent. So that's the terminology around it.
Yeah. So this one gives us the opportunity and the chance to apply for a consent for the long-term, the 35-year solution, and to have it operational within the agreed timeline of the enforcement order. Whereas another land-based option would never be achieved within that 5-year timeframe. It's less than 5 years. It's more than that.
I don't disagree that the land that discharge into hopefully the Colorado through a new channel is our only option right now. And that in the short term, that must be under any scenario what we're going to do. But when you refer to the experts, and the experts were given certain parameters, they were given a parameter that said, what can we do in 5 years? What can we do in 10 years? What can we do in 20 years? And that's actually where I'm driving, is not what are we going to do, in the next year. I never thought that we could suddenly start disposing of land next March. That's BS. But the fact is, why didn't we give parameters that allowed us to come up with that allowed the possibility of a really long-term solution that might be hybrid or might be solely to land?
I think that's what council agreed. That's what they resolved.
It was our fault. We found the enemy in there. No, I agree.
But we've actually got, council just invested $50 million in the Second Valley Fund. that is going to take us out to about roughly 2048, I think, in terms of treatment. It's probably going to be sooner than that. The requirements for this consent application was to be able to deal with that treated wastewater that comes out of those plants and to provide some headroom beyond that. You don't invest that sort of money on a 10-year consent for a long-term discharge. Now, there is a separate question around whether we continue to centralise on that plant or not, but we have currently a need to be able to dispose of that highly treated wastewater. We don't have many options around. That's the reason for the timeframes of the consent. And we're talking about significant, literally hundreds of millions of dollars of investment around which you need to make some critical funding decisions, hence the long-term consent application.
So just following up on that, so if I may, you talk about, yes, we've invested a ton of capex there, so it's, we're not going to walk away from it. How do we avoid having this conversation in 5 years' time when we've just invested a ton of capex in a long-term discharge solution into the river, and because we've invested all that money, it then becomes our reason why we can't move away from it? So that's, how do we avoid over capitalizing and therefore prejudicing future decisions? That's, I think it's a reasonable question.
It's a reasonable question, but this is not the cheapest option, just to be clear around that. The cheapest option is to continue to discharge into the Shadow in its current location. That would be the cheapest option. And we're talking about adding filtration, other things. I need to cover off that we're also proposal from the team is to also increase the UV disinfection on our existing discharge to give us a higher standard, but we'll come to that. But in terms of the least capital cost, the direct discharge and the carry through the mechanism that we are proposing provides the least cost in that sense. So you're not over-capitalising. If you start to put in pumping stations and discharge up onto the Franklin Delta, for example, and then we're going to walk away from that in the future because we're going to go somewhere else, that would be a sunk cost that you might lose. But under every scenario, option one is seen as being necessary as an emergency discharge or a long-term discharge point under any of the other options. So our response is that we're not over-capitalising through this. If we start to add other interim plants in, that we might walk away from, then there's that risk.
Yeah, just adding on.
Quentin's online as well, it's good seeing up. Quentin.
Yeah, thanks. The discussion's probably moved on quite a bit, but I just wanted to give a bit. I do fear that we risk going around in circles on there, but what I wanted to achieve was firstly that we need better engagement and alignment with the iwi for obvious reasons, and we know the risks associated with that. And secondly, I just don't want to see those impractical solutions on the options anymore. I found that to be the most unhelpful part of the previous work, was that we had two solutions particularly that didn't achieve anything, well, that were either unfeasible or didn't achieve anything. And the Crown Terrace one and the artificial wetland below the end of the dam, the end of the thing, just shouldn't have been there. They just weren't helpful to our consideration at all. Now, equally, I want to have understand some value management on the discharge options as well, because I don't think this armoured rock channel thing is all that cracks up to be either. So I suppose just, rather than explain what I do want, I thought it was useful to explain what I don't want.
The other thing I was going to say, John, in relation to your question just before, is that whether we're talking about a 35-year consent out to 2060 or a 20-year consent roughly to get to where the plant currently sits in 2048, we're really just talking about numbers on a page. The pipe size might change slightly to get it to the river, and you're applying for a slightly longer consent in terms of years. But again, there's no requirement that you have to keep using it for that period of time. So the increase in cost for that solution for 35 years would be, marginally more expensive than one for 22 years, but not significantly. And it gives this organisation the option to keep using it if nothing else comes along. If something else does come along, there's nothing to stop a council from choosing to go for it and apply for a new consent and do it.
The CCO.
Towards somewhere through this, I wouldn't mind getting your comments, Julian, if you feel like making it.
You'll appreciate I'm not across all the detail and all of the legal ramifications and so forth. But, you know, fundamentally, when I listen to this, I just have the question, why are we here today? We need to be honest and open about that. And I think the answer to that is some level of process failure. So given that that's happened, how do we take a step that shows we recognise that? I would suggest you're facing the fact that you're going to discharge into the river. You have no choice for a period of time. So what could I communicate to concerned people that says I've recognised that? Personally, I think applying for 35-year consent doesn't signal that at all. So if it was me, I'd be looking at, well, what could I signal? I could signal I need to have a consent in place. It's realistically, pragmatically, probably needs to be at least 5 years, you might argue 10. And you'd be signalling you recognised, you know, that there are issues here to be progressed so that you're going to go on a journey with people. That's fine.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, and we've talked about this as well in terms of consent timeframes, and you know, certainly a 5-year consent would be not long enough because it takes more than 5 years to achieve the next step anyway. But you know, my view was that the 35-year consent just sets up something that, if nothing else, there's nothing else that can, you know, that comes up in the meantime, you've at least got that to carry on with. You don't need to keep applying for new consents for the same thing.
So where I was coming from, I guess, was predominantly from the optics.
Yeah, but then, yeah, but for me, the optics were that we were, you know, we are going back to relook at other options that involve land disposal in some form or other, whether it's entirely
like I'm saying this on this hand and I'm behaving this way on the other hand.
Yes, but it's being realistic about where we are currently.
He's got his hand up.
I guess just the takeaways from this workshop today, because I'm sort of starting to have a bit of feeling sometimes around this table that we're having workshops to think about what we can do at the next workshop and what we can do at the next workshop. And as far as some direction, like, is there anything we can give you here collectively as direction around some assumptions that were potentially not how we would have thought they were good enough, i.e. one single land parcel, 2 boreholes on the Frankton Flats, annual flow assumptions and things like that. And we say, look at these in particular and maybe loosen them up, or maybe try to look at those to give you some more direction. At the same time, saying probably you can start engagement with Mike and say, come to us with any and all of your suggestions, including parcels of land that they've got available for us to discharge to, that they'll be willing to gift into this. And then same with identifying like stakeholders earlier rather than later, given the fact that we're under some time pressure here. Is there something you'd leave today with to get that process started quicker?
Well, the first thing that to get the process started, leaving today, is agreement broadly to the approach. But if you have some direction that you want to give about assumptions and things that we can take immediately into that process, then that would be great. The first step is making sure you're all comfortable with how we're going to approach this next phase.
And just in response to that, again, using process to use the S infrastructure to have work through that further in terms of what those assumptions are as a way of teasing those out, making sure there's good coverage of them.
Because I feel like we as a group sat down and picked holes in the assumptions about which we didn't think were strong enough or appropriate, things like that. So maybe we don't need experts, expensive experts, to come back with some of that guidance around what the assumptions we think could be correct in the first instance.
That's a good idea. I mean, I think there's a sort of two ways of looking at this: understanding what the assumptions were that led to the current list, testing that. Testing that again, are those all valid? Do we want to tweak some of those? Do we want to change those? What does that look like? Then there'd be reporting back around if we change those assumptions, what does that mean in terms of are there any other options? What's the cost of those options? What it would look like? Those sort of things. That's intended in terms of the process with the assets and infrastructure when you provided some oversight around that. So broadly, today was about saying, are you happy with this broad and three-pronged approach, knowing that there's further detail to be worked through. The deliberative democracy process, we're going to need to really kick that off and give some information on that quite quickly, and we'll have a discussion shortly around the mana whenua.
I mean, my feedback from I'm trying to work out whether it's a mutated octopus or something that's just trying to swim upstream against the flow of effluent coming towards it.
Treat it as well.
It's a lovely image, it'll stay with me. I think mana whenua, would probably want to have a view on the structure. That's, at a very high level, is this a good way? Because we've assumed that maybe Art might be able to speak to that, but are we in the danger of pigeonholing in the diagram without actually having had that conversation? But I may have had those conversations. Do you want to just speak to that?
I forgot about the mutated octopus. The thing that's probably changed since I last saw this picture and today is we got the letter last week. I think the letter quite clearly states what their expectation is from here. My concern, I suppose, is a risk around engaging with the mana whenua partnership based on the resolution as is I think the letter quite clearly says that they're not interested in that. There's not enough time involved. The request is quite clearly for an extension for 12 months. The extension request is not necessarily.
Sorry.
Yeah. I think we'll come to that.
Yeah,
Come to that.
come back to that.
All of the things being equal, and if we're in a position where we are able to have those conversations, which we'll probably talk to the next. But or do you think that this sort of model might work?
I think
if an attention to resolve,
interested in something like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a time.
Yeah, no, Brendan, did you have something else you were going to say?
I think I would say something.
Okay.
I just wanted to add something though about your comments, John, around the longer term solutions. I'd just like to note that you have the Infrastructure and Assets Committee has a session on the wastewater strategy in terms of, looking to that long term and how that's going to be approached in 3 weeks. Yeah, in a few weeks, beginning first week of June, I think. And so there is a kind of, whilst they're obviously related, I think when you see that and engage in a discussion about that, maybe we can come back to the question about how these two are related. Because I think at the moment you're operating in a bit of a vacuum about knowing what thinking has been done and engaging you in that thinking around the long-term kind of strategic approaches for wastewater. So I think that would be worthwhile revisiting once you've had that session, which is in about 3 weeks. Sorry.
Go Nikki first.
Vince, just a few quick things. The criteria, firstly, I'd like to see a timeframe on how all this fits together. So which bits get done first and how long they take, just to make sure we can actually do it. With the shortlist validation piece, that looks like another MCA scoring. I think we also need to look at the criteria that we're scoring against. So as part of the revision, because otherwise we could again end up with the same thing. And I think that was it. So, sorry, one more piece. The strategy piece that we're going in the background. So there's supposed to be a wastewater piece going on in the background about centralisation versus other things. And of course, we've got fast tracks and things coming into the mix. So I'd like to know.
That's the workshop.
Oh, sorry, that's
Yeah.
the workshop you're talking about. Perfect.
So
Okay.
it's first week of June.
Thank you. Great.
Do you want something?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. I just wanted to remind everyone to be cognizant of this thing called a water services strategy, which will be coming around, in months to come.
Yeah, which covers wastewater as well as stormwater.
Also, keeping in mind though that the water services strategy is not really a strategy. It's got some strategic elements. What you're going to see from Helen and the team in that workshop in the first week of June, that level of detail and thinking about what the solution, what the possible futures are, that level of detail is not in the water services strategy. The water services strategy is more related to the investments required to deliver it. And it's a higher level. So we use strategy in multiple ways. So they're both really important for you to consider. The first thing is what Helen and the team are going to come and talk to you about, and then water services strategy is also really important.
So can I just ask to be clear then, in whether it's within this process or the strategy workshop. So if we're obviously our investment strategy has got us to where we are, bigger pipes coming longer distances, the same place. That's been our model. So if we were going to, criteria review, what would wastewater in 2040 look like if it was resilient earthquake, sort of redundant, dispersed, or sort of what would be the questions or what would need to change if we were looking to minimise what goes into the river? Where do those questions come into that investment and that future planning?
So that will come really, I think, in the strategic review piece in 2nd of June. Unless there is, in terms of what we're currently looking at here, we do have an existing plant, existing discharge that we need to deal with. So this part is looking at whether there are any options for that, which we're going to explore openly. We anticipate that the question of centralisation, decentralisation is a critical part of the wastewater strategy that we're bringing to you. And we're seeing currently with the fast track consent applications a breakout around that. So that's we see. But fundamentally, unless we can find a different location to discharge the treated wastewater from this plant, we do have some issues. So there's two parts to that. One is dealing with this current fixed infrastructure at the moment, what we do with that. And secondly, longer term, what does that look like? And the longer term question.
So does some of this process face the longer term? Because I think how people will feel and how communities will feel about what we're doing in the short, medium term, that will be depending entirely on what they see as the context for the longer term.
So I think
so that's because what I'll put up with now might be different if I know that there's a potential for something different 10 years, 15 years down the line. So it's make sure that we're...
So we need to bring those together.
So certainly in terms of this, if you're looking at a land-based disposal option for the current investment, when I talk about the second MLE plant, that will have a certain driver in terms of land area, land capability, land types, if we're going to do that. It will then set a limit in some sense. If we're looking at the future, that's not our water-based disposal or river-based disposal, then you need to give further consideration of what that additional land capacity or alternative disposal technology would be.
Or dispersed locations. Decentralised versus decentralised.
And we're seeing that in terms of the number of fast track consent applications, most notably Homestead Bay. Long term, we're putting a whole lot of eggs in a wastewater treatment plant and a long-term land-based disposal option there that doesn't fail. So there are some risks around that as well.
You're still waiting to see if they can actually achieve that.
I've said they've got a consent for it. But I suppose I'm just trying to put, today was, are you happy with the broad approach in terms of the three strengths? Now I'm going to come back around the timing of these. We still need to have a conversation around the monophenol component. Happy with the broad concept of the deliberative democracy component. We'll come back around what that looks like and the timing of that. Proposals use the asset infrastructure, test some of the assumptions. We'll make some notes here, but we can do that. General agreement with that, because if there's not agreement with that, then we need to figure out how we're going to get to December in order to be able to respond back in March.
Could you give us a timeline?
Sean, you had a...
I think I'm comfortable with all of that, Tony. I think there's an element that missing though. Listening to what Julian said, which I was comfortable with because it was almost word for word with some of the things I've been saying for a few months now. It's about taking the community along the journey with us. And looking at what happened in the Banks Peninsula and Palmerston North context, the communications around this was very different. They were very clear. Now, they were confident that what they were doing and progressively improving what was going to the river in the interim while they were the harbour and Akaroa's case. So they were investing in the infrastructure. The question that was growing was where was the waste going to go, the wastewater going to go in the long run. We've got a peculiar dichotomy at the moment in this district and beyond, that in media and social media, it is being said that untreated waste is going into the lake, let alone the river. Now, that's kind of helpful to what John's saying, because it's people are going, well, we need a solution. Well, it's not entirely true. But if we are confident that what is coming from the plant and will continue to, and with the investment that we proposed will improve over the next few years, 5 years is too long, the next few years, we should be saying so loud and clear to make sure that people and other partners are aware that we are taking this seriously and addressing the problem now. We're addressing it in the medium term, and together we'll address it into the future. We're not doing that adequately at the moment, I don't think.
It's a good point, I think. I remember that because the previous council decisions have actually got a significantly improved wastewater discharge now through that investment. And it's a very high standard potential to that further treatment. And this is about improving discharge location. Everyone's aware of the situation we're in that generated the emergency works. We had no options at that point. So those are things that I agree. I don't think we've told that story well. And I think the misinformation and frankly disinformation that's out there doesn't help. So
it's not going to stop it, but we've got to balance it.
There is, okay, there is.
There is some.
You can't deny it, there is.
No, but are we giving the full facts as well? So
Well, that's another, that's,
be really careful
well,
about.
that's telling us. We're not telling us.
It's not a story. I think we need to be really careful about telling stories. We need to.
It's a form of
Okay, should we, I think you've got the direction.
I think I've got an additional point there, which is adding in a kind of comms.
strategy
Strategy and work stream that sits alongside this about probably the decisions that have been made so far, but also how we're working through this in the next phase.
And if we need some help with that, that would not be expensive. We wanted to beef that up.
So the octopus has 4 legs, not 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did we land on whether we get some independent look at the criteria? Was that
You're going to be looking at the assumptions and there'll be a peer review. That was what I heard.
That's right too, you mentioned that, if we have, if we know what the assumptions are, if there is actually a list of assumptions that we see there, and then it says council workshops more than one, so maybe that's an early one. And then, as you say, we have another workshop.
Can I just highlight that we've got Julian on board. We're going to have the board on board soon, and they're going to be sitting, we should add that here, because this council is also going to be the CCO board. And in terms of, expertise, being able to complement your input into it, we can have them there alongside also testing. There we go, appreciate it.
So
the list of things says assumption 1, 2, 3, 4. We're looking at the embedded assumptions that aren't necessarily.
We will bring all of those out.
Yeah, great.
Bring them all out.
Just, I'd caution you against using the word independent. Our experts that we have at the moment are independent. And they abide by a code of conduct for expert witnesses. So it's kind of disparaging to say that they're not independent. The point you're trying to make is that they were asked to tell us what the options are for something that can keep wastewater going, not something that might be possible in 10 or 15 or 20 years. That's what you're asking for this piece of work to do. So you shouldn't use language which makes it sound like they're not independent when they actually are, and they're the preeminent people in the country.
Independent of the current process is what I'm talking about. So the process and the people that we've used has spat out a certain outcome. I guess what some of us would like to see, and that would give us some comfort that this is going to be worthwhile, is that we get fresh eyes. So maybe that's a better way to put it. Instead of saying
Where you just keep following around till you get the answer you want. We've got people that are independent and they are experts in the field, and they are giving us their expert opinion on what the options are. So we can't say, well, we don't like your opinions. We'll just keep trying until we get someone else's opinions that we like.
Well, if the experts always agreed, we'd never have Environment Corps hearings, would we? Because often we find experts have very different views. And I think, that fresh set of eyes. I mean, to me, the criteria review is like the prompt that you put into AI, isn't it? Is what is the question that you ask will determine what you've got out. And what I see is what we've got out of the reports has been based on the questions we've asked. So, and within that, the data may or may not be there, or the content of the reports may or may not be there to support other questions. So that's just something to be cognizant of. It might be all the experts who are fully independent and authorised and goes in practice, they might say, actually, we can't answer that question because we were never asked that one. So that's something that we need to be able to address. And optics, you know, is it perception, is it reality? I think we really need to hear from Anna Fenway their expectations about how we recut, re-slice, you know, re-dice. They may have, I mean, they do a ton of work for Tonkin and Taylors. They might say they've got enough retainer. Could they? Who knows? But I don't think we should make that decision for them.
I'm not suggesting that that's coming up. I do need to say that there was a very extensive process looking at all the options, and I think echoing, we need to be careful about comments that, you know, experts brought a narrow view to that. It was a very extensive exploration of all the options. If you look at the full reports, they are independent. You may have a view that they took us to a decision, but the decision was based on a series of assumptions which are very clearly stated in the document. So
was peer reviewed as well.
I'd just like to challenge that statement, because when you run through the process, there was one option that was ruled out by the experts as being fatally flawed.
It wasn't ruled out by the
which it was scored and it was decided as fatally flawed by the experts. It's in the report. It was brought back onto the table at the request of staff.
It was fatally flawed under one criteria.
It was brought back onto the table at the request of staff as they do nothing comparator. And lo and behold, that is the one that the organisation recommends we adopt. So it's not black and white, I guess, is
It's
what
not
I'm
black
saying.
and white. The process is very clear about that group of experts. It was very transparent. We presented that to councillors in a very open and transparent manner so that you knew that when you made the decision. So, yeah. So, you know, happy with the broad approach. Interesting. We might represent the fourth component as well, the communications. So we'll come back with the details and the timing on how we might set that up. I'll have more details on the deliberative process. Happy that it's run under the Assets and Infrastructure Committee as a way of running the governance and check, which we need to have
Everyone else is welcome to attend.
As long as, so there'll be no decisions, it's just workshop.
Well, I can't make decisions, but in terms of working through the process, obviously if there's a decision around changing the assumptions or other things, it has to flow through. We don't have time to come back for multiple decisions as we work through this. We just need looking for the workshop to give us confidence that at the end of the day, there's been councillor input into that overall process. If there are decision points that are needed, I don't anticipate there will, then we can bring it back.
Bring it to the full council.
Yeah, I don't anticipate that we'll be bringing back a decision around changing the assumption. We won't be able to move that fast and get this process done.
So that might be a timely time to move to the Mana Whenua.
Yeah.
If I may, before we
in terms of if we're sitting at
online as well.
if we're sitting at governance with that committee, absolutely fine with that. Again, if Mana Whenua would say they would like to have somebody co-opted onto that group, I think we need to be ready to support that.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So
That committee.
yeah.
Oh, cool.
So I don't know, but
No, we're trying to have a very open process. We talked about the iwi concerns, but it's not about trying to have a closed process
No.
and try to separate out. So that's very much the intent. Hence, the reason today is to actually have this sort of conversation around the process from here, so we don't get to the end of the process, i.e. in December, and we face criticisms about the process not being appropriate. So that's
So he's still got his hand up.
that was the whole point of today. So just coding.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, just before we move on, wanted to add 2 cents because I think listening in, I'm picking up on what's creating some confusion, and I've sort of figured out where I sit with it. The point being, framing this, it feels like we're solving 2 problems in one. What do we do now and what do we do in the future? And I think they're not necessarily the same question, or at least there might not be the same answer. So I guess that's partly how framing it as what we're doing now to address the immediate concerns with the infrastructure that we've invested in. And then another framing of what should we do in the future, because one of the advantages we have is that we've got a lot of new growth. And I think a lot of the sentiment from Mana Whenua is how we're going to change how we do things to address the concerns that we have in front of us. So I just think it's important to frame it in that vein so we have less confusion around values and process, and we can sort of be more constructive on the input. Thanks.
Thanks, Cody. That preface, if I might. What I was thinking, and Tony's known me long enough to read my body language there, that my exactly that space. Yes, I think it's the right committee for it to be looked at as a set of solutions to a range of problems. However, if there's bigger, and I think there are, going forward when the water CCO is in place, much of this stuff, some of it will still sit in that committee, with a different brief, but much of it, along the lines of what Cody was, I think, alluding to, is actually about how we grow smartly in future. So some of this, the consequences, or some of the other issues might be for the Smart Growth Committee to look at, because they're bigger picture, and that committee will be picking up some of that stuff with a relationship with the CCO in future, is my view. So it's kind of, yes for now, but I think there's a bit more later.
Yeah, certainly I think the point around 2 decisions is a valid, and we've talked about that thing. Cool. So June will come back with that sort of the future, how this fits in.
Thanks.
Right now, we've got a fairly major decision in terms of this discharge. And there may be something that pops up between now and December that prompts an urgent decision of some description. But the intent is, through this process, if we're going to get through this with a group of people and with iwi, we need to have a sort of a clear run at it, understanding there's going to be touch points along the way, and certainly happy to have iwi involved all the way through. But the intent is to get on with this and use the asset and infrastructure as that governance council touch point around the process, so that there's an understanding of it. And of course, that's an invitation to every council. It's not just the so that's a formula talking.
We can pick up that broader growth conversation at the next Smart Growth Committee, because that's going to be one of the things we'll be, well, it's not next week. Sorry, I mean, it's not next week for discussion, because that's too soon.
Yeah.
This was my whole thought, like the
Later.
next one after that.
Yeah, sure.
Because we will be talking to you about the growth scenarios and
cool.
how we plan for growth, how we link that to fast tracks, all of that stuff. So I think it feeds into that conversation.
Great, thank you.
Right, we need to get on to item 2 anyway.
Can I just ask, who's directing, if we're getting a program person to manage this whole process, who are they going to be directed by? So is that going to be a staff member? Is that a new appointment? Is it someone from within the team existing?
No, it's the consideration is at the moment an external person.
So who will that person sit under? And I know the workshops are sitting with assets and infrastructure, but I guess I would like to think that we could have that person sit outside of assets and infrastructure, because of where this came from, and just to create some independence. And so
I think my understanding,
just
correct me if I'm wrong, Penny, was that from the strategic approach of what we're doing, that's your team.
Obviously working very closely with Tony and his team.
But from the providing the technical support and the staffing is from the P&I team. But the lead in pulling the strategy together is, well, maybe it's co-governance, but that was my understanding, and that I think was.
It would just be good to know, because it would be nice to see a little bit of strategic separation. Just
we'll take them into account. We haven't obviously got that person yet, so we haven't determined where they'll sit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Shall we move on to item 2? Yep. You can close the door.
Yes, so
restart recording.
Stop this recording.
Yeah, you Georgia.
Yeah, I'll stop this one and start another one. And
thank you.
You can stop.
Stop sharing.
You can stop sharing and close that as well.